We have our two speakers, Mr. Greg Hines, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Arctic Diagnostic, a molecular diagnostic company, and as you may know, they're commercializing a couple of genetic tests in colorectal cancer and age-related macular degeneration. He's formerly CEO of Bioscience and President of Leo Pharmaceuticals, and very interestingly is the entrepreneur in residence at the Mara Center in Toronto. Our opposing speaker is Mark McElwain, who is Vice President and Partner at Allard Johnson Communications. And I have to say right off the bat, Mark, that your very distinguished bio does not seem to belong to you. You seem to be far too young to belong to this particular bio, and I'm just wondering if it's a matter of genetic modification or marital status, either simultaneous or sequential. I'm not sure. In any case, Mark is Vice President and Partner at Allard Johnson Communications and is, of course, advising stakeholders on advertising interactive programs for pharma and healthcare clients. We'll now proceed immediately to the resolution, which actually has two sentences and a little editorial component, and maybe we can have that up there. And the vote. Resolved. The House believes that the current global financial crisis is largely the product of under-regulation. As part of a new wave of re-regulation, the life sciences industry in Canada and the U.S. should accept the inevitability of more government control and get over it. Those for, those against, les pour et les contre. There you go. So I now invite Greg Hines, and as I mentioned, we'll have 5 minutes vigorously enforced.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I can see that I'm already on the wrong side of this debate, but I knew that coming into the room. I started in the pharmaceutical industry and spent 30 years there. My first job was a sales rep selling Tylenol in the early 70s. My territory, virtually all of Ontario. And that was around 1972 when the provincial government instituted a regulation called par cost. And that allowed for the generic substitution of prescription drugs in the province, and it's been a downhill spiral ever since. So now that I've been out of the pharmaceutical industry for 10 years, I have a slightly different perspective. Maybe I did get over it, so to speak. So the question at hand is, do we need more regulation in healthcare? I believe we do. I'm going to focus my argument in favor of increased regulation on the following points. 1, regulations create a level playing ground for industry. 2, regulations protect industry from less regulated market competitors and inappropriate market influences. Regulations create clarity in the market for product development and promotion, and regulations are required as new technologies come to market. I will argue that the failure of regulations to deliver a level playing ground, clarity in the market to protect the players, have caused undue harm to the pharmaceutical industry. I will as well ask you to suggest that you recognize that the industry's attitudes against regulation has cost you dearly. Let's talk first about level playing field. When legislation is in place, but the regulations are insufficient, industry is exposed to the political whim of the politicians and the bureaucrats who develop guidelines, who develop and interpret the regulations to implement them as they see fit. I think this morning we heard speakers talk about intellectual property, PMPRB, and the fact that the regulations around both of those issues are not being executed with the same conviction or with the same level playing field, if you will, by the various provinces across the country. But healthcare has become more complicated than the prescription drug industry. The social push away from traditional or Western medicines in favor of natural remedies, nutraceuticals, and herbal medicines, I would submit that the regulatory framework for each of these categories is different and creates significant inequalities for industry. If one travels around Ottawa or Montreal these days, one will see adverts on billboards for a new therapeutic nutraceutical for Alzheimer's. It starts with a V, and I'm not talking about Viagra. This was a compound that the company was developing as a prescription drug. The phase 3 trial failed. The company abandoned its regulatory strategy, repositioned the product as a nutraceutical, and they are now selling it for the same medical indication. How can that be right? Another example of regulatory inequality is in the manufacturing process. We have heard, we all know about CGMP, the good manufacturing practices that we all have to adhere to when we're developing and manufacturing pharmaceuticals. These processes are built into the regulations for prescription drugs to ensure quality and consistency with the label claim. Prescription drug companies are routinely audited to ensure compliance with the regulations, but these same standards are not held to account for consumer products. There are no regulations requiring audits, and on this point I focus on the need to regulate enforcement of the regulations and not just leave it up to the bureaucrats to interpret it as they see fit. Audits should specifically be included in the regulations. A few years back, the Globe and Mail ran an interesting article where they reviewed some 40-odd vitamin preparations to see if those preparations actually met label claim and bioavailability claims with respect to daily allowances. Only 4 of the 40 products measured up. I spent a year on the board of an herbal medicine manufacturer. They could never meet the label claim with respect to the ingredients that should be in the product. It didn't matter. They were never audited. I left. Regulations can protect industry. If we look at clinical trial programs, and we talked about that earlier today, regulatory audits of clinical trials only cover 2% of the studies on prescription drugs that are run in this country. Do we really trust our competitors that much? We need to see regulatory audits specifically in the regulations. As we see the globalization of clinical trials that we talked about earlier today, where clinical trials are now more and more often being run in countries that we used to perceive as being third world, are they actually following the regulations? Are they being audited? When Merck had to recall Vioxx in 2004, they had a major issue with the regulations. They did meet the regulations at the time for ADRs. The regulations were weak, allowed the company to go to market. The company actually beat the regulatory strategy but lost at the end of the day. Regulations on marketing are sorely needed. The industry has not been able to demonstrate that it can live up to its own code of marketing practices. Last week, 2 weeks ago, my business partner's wife, who's an internist, spent a beautiful week in Paris on the account of a large brand name pharmaceutical company. And I think the herbal industry takes significant rights with their promotion and advertising claims without any institution of the regulations. So I'll leave it at that and come back with a summary where I think I'll dig a little bit deeper into the par cost issue and what I see as being the essence or the real problem that the industry has to face with respect to regulations. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Greg. I'll invite Mark McElwain to come and oppose, and I think we might have to start calling this change from pharmaceutical to nutraceutical, maybe phase 5 development plan. But anyway.
Well, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for the invitation today, again, I guess. This is a three-peat for me. And I enjoy the opportunity to spar lightly with Greg Hines, who a few years ago was actually on my board of directors, so he was one of my bosses. There's a question that lots of people